When Amelia Carter opened her eyes after the crash, the first name she whispered was not her mother's, not her father's, not the man she had almost married. She breathed out one word: Logan. Find Logan. Her family stood frozen because none of them had ever heard that name in her life. Across the city, a quiet single father named Logan Walker answered a call from the hospital and went pale before the nurse finished speaking. He knew exactly why Amelia had said his name. What terrified him was that she was never supposed to remember that night at all. If you want to know what Logan hid and why Amelia said his name first, stay until the very end. The recovery room smelled of antiseptic and cold light, and for a handful of seconds Amelia did not recognize her own mother's face. She had just come out of surgery after her sedan lost control on the highway and slammed into the median wall. Her voice was barely a breath when she spoke, but the words were clear enough that no one in the room could pretend they had misheard. Logan. Logan Walker. Don't let Cameron find him. Then her eyes closed again, pulled under by the weight of the medication. Joseph, Elizabeth, and Mason looked at one another in the too bright silence, and none of them could produce an answer. No one in the family had ever heard Amelia mention a man named Logan Walker. Not once, not in passing, not at a holiday dinner or a late-night phone call. What bothered Mason most was not the mystery of the name itself, but the shape of the sentence around it. Amelia had ended her engagement to Cameron nearly a year earlier. So why, in the most dangerous moment of her life, had she spoken of Cameron and an unfamiliar man in the same breath, as though one were a threat and the other a shelter? Cameron was standing in the hallway outside, present in his role as the company's chief financial officer and as the man who had once been closest to Amelia in the world. When Mason asked him if he knew anyone named Logan Walker, Cameron paused for less than a second before saying he had never heard the name in his life. It was a small pause, the kind most people would never notice. But it did not go unnoticed. The hand holding his phone had tightened. Mason asked Amelia's personal assistant to check her calendar, her contacts, and her email threads for any trace of the man. There was nothing. No meeting, no phone number, no personnel file anywhere in the system. Logan Walker did not appear to exist inside any record connected to Amelia's life. And yet a nurse folding Amelia's jacket for storage found a small piece of paper tucked into an inner pocket. On it was a phone number, the initials LW, and a line in Amelia's own handwriting that read, "If anything happens, call him first." Mason dialed the number immediately. Across the city, in a small house on a quiet street, Logan Walker was making breakfast before driving his daughter to a relative's home for the day. His phone rang. When he heard the words, "Do you know Amelia Carter?" he went completely still. His first question was not who is calling or what is this about. He asked only one thing, in a voice barely above a whisper. Is she alive? That single question told Mason more than any denial could have. Logan had not asked who Amelia was. He already knew exactly who she was, and exactly what kind of morning this could become. A junior nurse who had overheard the exchange later told a colleague that she had never seen a stranger answer a phone call about someone else's family with that particular kind of fear. It was not the fear of a man caught doing something wrong. It was the fear of a man who had spent months trying to keep someone safe and had just learned he might have failed. Logan asked for the name of the hospital, the floor, and whether anyone had told the family his name yet. Mason, still holding the receiver, felt the ground shift slightly beneath his certainty. He had expected denial, or confusion, or the practiced smoothness Cameron had offered only minutes earlier. Instead, he was getting urgency, precise and unpolished, from a man who clearly already understood more about the situation than anyone standing in that hallway. Mason pressed him further, demanding to know what connection Logan had to his sister. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Mason nearly repeated the question. Then Logan answered, quiet and steady, in a voice that carried no apology at all. "I am the man who told her not to get into that car." The story reached back 3 months before the accident, to a season when Carter Mobility was racing to finish a new electronic control system for its self-driving fleet and preparing to sign the largest contract in the company's history. Somewhere inside that pressure, strange technical failures began appearing in the testing reports. Every time, the finance and operations teams marked them as minor and moved on. Amelia did not believe that. She understood the danger of opening a formal internal investigation too soon. Stock value could collapse overnight. The board could freeze her authority before she found anything, and whoever was behind the failures could erase every trace of evidence long before anyone noticed. So Amelia went looking for someone entirely outside the company, someone with no ties to Carter Mobility at all. A lawyer who handled technical accident cases gave her one name: Logan Walker had once been a senior safety engineer at a major automotive firm, respected for his precision, until he refused to sign off on a design he believed was dangerous. That single refusal had quietly frozen his career for years afterward. Amelia found him at a small independent testing shop after hours, and their first meeting held nothing close to romance. Amelia was used to being recognized the moment she walked into a room. Logan barely looked up from the file in front of him. He asked her only one question. "Do you want the truth, or do you want a report that lets your board sleep at night?" Amelia bristled at that, but something about a man who was not the least bit impressed by her power pulled at her attention anyway. Logan agreed to examine the data under two conditions. His name would never appear inside any company system, and Amelia could not alter his conclusions no matter how badly they hurt Carter Mobility. That was why her family had never heard of him. Her own assistant had never heard of him. The two of them communicated through a second phone and met only in places far from her office. As the weeks passed, Logan realized the failures were not random at all. Someone had deliberately altered the testing parameters. Worse, every altered file traced back to a single supplier, one approved directly through the chief financial officer's office. That office belonged to Cameron. At first, Amelia refused to accept the direction the evidence was pointing. Cameron had once been the person she trusted above everyone else in her life. Logan never pushed an accusation on her. He simply told her what the numbers showed. "I don't know who did this," he said. "I only know the data is lying to somebody." That was the moment Amelia first understood that Logan was not trying to manipulate her toward any conclusion of his own. He was only trying to make the truth visible, whatever it turned out to be. Amelia had grown used to people either flattering her instincts or quietly steering her away from anything inconvenient. Logan did neither. When she asked him once whether he ever worried about being wrong, he told her that being wrong was the least dangerous outcome available to either of them. Being quiet, he said, was the one that got people hurt. She found herself repeating that line in board meetings weeks later, without ever explaining where it came from. Their arrangement stayed strictly professional on paper, a handful of meetings scattered across a season, a trail of encrypted messages that existed nowhere in the company's official record. But somewhere in the accumulation of small, ordinary exchanges, Amelia began arriving early to their meetings, and Logan began staying a few minutes longer than the work required. 2 days before the accident, Logan found something that stopped him cold. The electronic systems on the exact test sedan Amelia usually drove carried the same pattern of alterations he had already traced through the falsified data. Back in the present, Logan arrived at the hospital after arranging for his daughter to stay with a relative for the day. It was the only time Ella appeared in the early part of the story, a brief detail that simply confirmed Logan was truly raising a child on his own. He came alone, dressed plainly, with no attorney and no assistant trailing behind him, a striking contrast to the Carter family filling the waiting area. Mason intercepted him outside Amelia's room and asked him directly how long he had known her, why she had hidden him from her own family, and how he already knew something had happened to the car. Logan refused to answer in a public hallway. Cameron approached a moment later, and for the first time the two men stood face to face. Cameron appeared perfectly composed. Logan matched his calm without effort, but Logan noticed the watch on Cameron's wrist, and something about it tugged at his memory. A reflection he had seen once on a glass door in a security recording taken from the testing garage. It was not proof of anything yet, so Logan said nothing. The family's suspicion began drifting toward Logan instead, with Mason even asking whether there had been some hidden romantic relationship between him and Amelia. Logan answered with a single word: no. But when he glanced through the glass toward Amelia lying in the bed, something in his expression softened just slightly, enough that Elizabeth noticed the answer was not quite as simple as it sounded. The doctor explained that Amelia had a head injury, gaps in her short-term memory, and an otherwise stable condition. The police initially treated the crash as a mechanical failure and nothing more. Logan asked them to preserve the vehicle for independent inspection before it went anywhere near the company. Cameron objected immediately, arguing that the car was Carter Mobility property and needed to return to the technical department for review. Logan said if that car goes back to the company before an outside party examines it, every piece of evidence on it will disappear. The mood in the hallway shifted. Joseph began watching Logan the way he might study an engineer he had just hired rather than a stranger who had wandered in from nowhere. Cameron asked who exactly Logan thought he was to make such demands. Logan answered plainly, "No one at all. That's precisely why Amelia chose me." The line landed harder than Logan intended, because it touched the truth sitting beneath everything. Amelia had stopped trusting nearly everyone inside her own circle of power. Elizabeth pulled her husband aside once the hallway had cleared and asked, quietly, whether he actually believed a stranger over the man their daughter had nearly married. Joseph did not answer right away. He had built Carter Mobility from a single testing garage decades earlier, and he still remembered what it felt like to be the only person in a room willing to say a design was unsafe when everyone else wanted to ship it anyway. Something about the set of Logan's jaw reminded him of that version of himself, the one who had not yet learned to soften his conclusions for people with more money than patience. He told Elizabeth only that he intended to find out for certain, one way or another, before he let anyone push Logan out of the picture. In the end, Joseph used his influence to have the police hold the vehicle for review, and Cameron had no way to stop him. Before Cameron left the hospital that night, he sent a message from his phone that no one else saw. Walker has surfaced. Handle the file before Amelia remembers more. While Amelia continued to recover, the story wove back through memories of how her relationship with Logan had actually begun. At first, everything between them was strictly business. They met at the testing shop, at a small coffee place inside an old equipment storage unit, and once at a testing lot on the edge of the city. Amelia always arrived without a bodyguard trailing behind her. Slowly, Logan came to see that she was nothing like the cold, distant figure the press liked to describe. Amelia, in turn, realized Logan was not bitter about the career that had been taken from him. He simply hated watching people use money to hide danger from those who would never see it coming. One evening, Amelia happened to catch Logan leaving a meeting early because he needed to pick up his daughter. It was only a brief, passing mention of Ella, nothing more than a glimpse of the life he carried outside their meetings. That was how Amelia first learned Logan was raising a child alone, that his wife had passed away some years earlier. He never spoke about it for long. He only said, after that, I stopped living as though work was the most important thing in the world. The sentence struck something in Amelia she rarely allowed herself to feel. Her entire life had narrowed down to almost nothing but Carter Mobility. From that point forward, their meetings began carrying a few extra minutes of conversation that had nothing to do with engineering reports. Amelia told him that Cameron had once been her fiancé, and that they had separated because Cameron had slowly begun treating their marriage as a business alliance rather than a partnership. Her family, she admitted, still adored him. Logan offered no opinion either way. It was exactly that refusal to judge that made Amelia feel safe around him. One rainy night, when her car refused to start, Logan drove her home. Standing outside her door, she asked him, "Do you ever wonder why I trust you?" Logan answered, "I do, but I don't think you're ready to answer that yet." Amelia smiled, fully and easily, in a way that felt entirely her own. There was no kiss that night. No declaration. Only the quiet, gradual sense of closeness building between two people who had not expected to find it. Soon after, Logan discovered that the altered components could cause the electronic braking system to lose response under a very specific set of conditions. Amelia wanted to bring the evidence straight to the board. Logan stopped her, arguing they still lacked the missing link that would prove who was responsible. Amelia asked if he was trying to protect her. Amelia said, "I'm protecting the truth. You just happen to be standing in the middle of it." Even so, it was clear by then that Logan had already begun caring for her far more than he was willing to admit out loud. Amelia had not told anyone, not even Mason, how often she found herself thinking about those small ordinary evenings once she was back inside her own glass office. She would sit through budget reviews and product briefings and catch herself comparing the noise of that world to the stillness of Logan's testing shop, where nothing mattered except whether the numbers told the truth. It unsettled her a little how much she preferred the second version of her life. She never said as much to Logan directly, but she stopped scheduling their meetings during business hours, choosing evenings instead, telling herself it was simply more convenient. Logan never questioned the change. He only noticed it. Security footage later showed that someone using a high-level access card had entered Amelia's private garage at 17 minutes past 1 in the morning, only a single day before the accident occurred. 2 days later, Amelia was noticeably more alert, and her family gathered close around her bed. Logan was not present, since Mason still had not fully decided to trust him. Amelia recognized her parents and her brother without hesitation. When Cameron stepped into the room, her body tensed in a way she could not quite explain to herself. She remembered Logan clearly, yet the 3 days before the accident remained fractured in her mind, scattered like pages torn from a notebook. She asked where Logan was. Elizabeth asked who exactly this man was. Amelia looked around the room at her own family as though the question itself was harder to answer than it should have been. Finally, she said, "He's the only person I know who wouldn't lie to me." The words landed hard on Joseph, and they unsettled Cameron even more. Logan was allowed into the room shortly after. The moment Amelia saw him, her whole body seemed to settle, though Logan kept a careful, professional distance. He did not take her hand. He did not use any familiar name for her. Amelia asked him what she had found before the crash. Logan understood immediately that her memory of it was gone. He did not push her to remember. Cameron tried to stay in the room, but Amelia asked him to leave, and it was the first time her family saw plainly that she no longer trusted him at all. Logan told her only that the vehicle had been tampered with, though there was still no proof pointing directly at Cameron. A fragment of memory surfaced in Amelia's mind. A basement level, a red warning light, a folder of documents, Cameron's voice speaking to someone on the phone. Then a sharp headache overtook her, and the doctor asked everyone to stop. Logan prepared to leave. Amelia unexpectedly reached out and caught his wrist, a small gesture that Elizabeth noticed immediately. Amelia told him, "You promised you wouldn't disappear." Mason asked what that promise meant. Logan gave no answer. A short memory followed from the night before the crash, when Amelia had told Logan that once the investigation ended, she might want to see him somewhere that had nothing to do with technical files between them. Logan had teased her, "That sounds like a date." Amelia had answered, "Maybe it is one." It was the first clearly confirmed hint of romance in the story, though still kept gentle and understated. Back in the present, Logan told her simply, "I'm still here." Through the glass of the door, Cameron watched the two of them together, his expression unreadable. After Logan left the room, Mason lingered by the window, turning the whole exchange over in his mind. He had spent 3 days building a case against a man he now realized had answered every accusation with steadiness instead of defense. Guilty men, in Mason's experience running due diligence on countless vendors, tended to explain themselves too much. Logan had barely explained himself at all. He had simply stayed, answered what he could, and left the rest for Amelia to remember on her own time. Mason found that harder to argue with than any alibi could have been, and for the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to wonder if he had been chasing the wrong man entirely. Not long after, Cameron received word that the police had found evidence of manual tampering on the braking module itself. The police officially reclassified the crash from an accident into a criminal investigation. One detail immediately complicated matters. Logan's technical access credentials had once been used to pull data from the testing system. Cameron seized on that fact without hesitation, telling Joseph and Mason that Logan had the knowledge, the access, and a plausible motive for revenge against an industry that had once destroyed his career. A large sum of money was also discovered, transferred from a private account belonging to Amelia directly to Logan. On the surface, it looked damning. Mason's anger flared instantly, convinced that Logan had taken advantage of his sister. Logan explained it was a confidential consulting fee tied to an agreement between them. But the agreement existed only in an encrypted file that Amelia had stored privately, one no one could open until she remembered the password. Joseph asked Logan to stay away from Amelia until the situation became clearer. Logan agreed without any argument at all. That quiet compliance only made Amelia angrier once she learned about it, because it felt like her family was once again making decisions for her without asking. Lying in her hospital bed, Amelia tried to piece together the broken fragments of memory. She recalled handing Logan a small storage drive at some point, though she could not remember where it had gone. Meanwhile, Cameron quietly pressured the board, suggesting that if Amelia was not fit to run the company, a temporary chief executive would be needed, and he proposed Mason for the role. That single move was the first thing that made Mason genuinely suspicious of Cameron, since he seemed far more focused on power than on his sister's recovery. Back at Logan's house, a brief scene showed him with Ella, who noticed her father was not himself and asked whether the woman from his work was going to be okay. Logan told her, "I hope so." Ella played no further part in the unfolding investigation. While sorting through the coat he had worn the last night he saw Amelia, Logan found a small object tucked into an inner pocket. A locker key. He remembered then that the night before the crash, Amelia had pressed it into his hand and said, "If I ever change my mind about this, don't listen to me." At the time he had thought she was joking. Now he understood she had been afraid of being watched. The locker was registered at Union Station. Logan did not go alone, he called Mason. It was a turning point that mattered, because Logan could easily have hidden whatever the locker held, and instead he invited the very man who suspected him most to come along. Something in Mason's attitude toward him began to shift from that moment forward. The train station was loud and indifferent around them, commuters moving past without a glance at the two men standing before a wall of metal doors. Mason watched Logan's hands as he turned the key, half expecting hesitation, some final flicker of guilt before the truth came out. There was none. Logan opened the locker the way a man opens something he has been dreading and waiting for in equal measure, and for a moment neither of them spoke, both aware that whatever sat inside would either clear a name or end a career for good. Inside the locker they found a storage drive, a set of financial records, and a short audio recording labeled, "If anything happens to me." Logan and Mason listened to the recording together. Amelia's voice confirmed that she had secretly hired Logan, that he had no involvement whatsoever in any act of sabotage, and that she suspected fraud somewhere inside Carter Mobility. Even so, she stopped short of naming Cameron directly, explaining that she needed stronger proof before accusing anyone by name. The storage drive revealed the rest. A shell supplier had sold defective components to Carter Mobility. That supplier was controlled indirectly through several layers of shell entities, and the money ultimately traced back to an investment fund connected to Cameron. The motive became painfully clear. Cameron had quietly earned tens of millions from the arrangement, and if the technical failures were ever exposed, he would face charges of fraud and endangerment. What still remained missing was direct proof that Cameron had personally ordered the sabotage of the vehicle. Mason apologized to Logan for jumping to conclusions so quickly. Logan didn't need the apology. He asked only one thing in return: that Mason protect his sister. Mason asked him directly, "Do you love her?" Logan was quiet for a long moment before answering, "I haven't let myself go that far yet." Mason understood exactly what the answer really meant. The two men agreed not to let Cameron know the drive had been found, choosing instead to work quietly alongside the police. Amelia continued recovering, and more memories slowly returned to her. She remembered going back down to the company's basement level the night of the crash to retrieve a folder of documents, and overhearing Cameron on the phone. She caught the words, "Tomorrow she'll know everything," before slipping away unseen. She called Logan afterward. He told her not to drive the company's test sedan under any circumstances. She agreed. But when she left the building, her own car would not start, and an employee handed her the backup test sedan without either of them realizing it was the very vehicle Logan had warned her about. That explained, logically, why she still ended up behind its wheel that night. In her hospital bed, another memory surfaced suddenly. Just before the brakes failed, a warning light had flashed on the dashboard. She had called Logan through the hands-free system. He talked her through the emergency procedures, step by step, guiding her to slow the car safely. That was why she survived, and that was why his name was the last thing her mind held onto before everything went dark. Amelia asked the detective assigned to her case, once she was strong enough to sit through the interview, why Logan had never simply handed the recording over the moment he found it. The detective admitted that most people in his experience did exactly that, eager to clear their own name as fast as possible. Logan had done the opposite, holding the evidence until it could actually prove something rather than simply protect himself. Amelia was not surprised. It matched everything else she had learned about him since the night she first walked into his testing shop, looking for someone who would tell her the truth instead of the version she wanted to hear. Investigators later determined that the person who had used the access card to enter the garage was not Cameron at all, but a technician who had died in what looked like an accident 6 weeks earlier. The new discovery made the case far more complicated. Cameron had never touched the vehicle himself. He had used a technician who was struggling financially at the time. When that technician later tried to back out, he died 6 weeks earlier in what was quietly labeled an accident. The police did not yet have enough to connect Cameron directly to that death. Logan proposed a plan built on a single piece of false information, letting it be known that the technician had left behind a complete copy of the data before he died. Mason made sure the story reached Cameron. Cameron changed his approach almost immediately, arriving at the hospital under the pretense of apologizing to Amelia and putting an end to the conflict between them. Amelia had already been prepared by the police beforehand. What followed became the emotional center of everything that had happened since the crash. Cameron tried to convince Amelia that Logan had been manipulating her from the start. He aimed straight at her weaknesses. Logan was an outsider, her family barely knew him, she was still recovering from memory loss, and she might easily be confusing gratitude for something deeper. Amelia stayed composed through all of it. She told him, "The difference is that Logan never once asked me to trust him. He told me to check everything myself." Cameron began losing his composure. Amelia mentioned carefully and deliberately that the police had recovered an audio recording from the technician. Cameron's reaction was instant and unguarded. He couldn't have recorded anything. I took his phone before. He stopped himself too late. The sentence had already been captured. Police officers stepped into the room. Cameron tried to leave but was taken into custody on the spot. Between the financial records, the garage access data, and his own unintended confession, there was more than enough to expand the case far beyond anyone's expectations. There was no dramatic chase, no physical struggle. The turning point was simply Cameron exposing himself with his own words. After he was led away, Amelia did not celebrate. She stared at the empty room and understood, fully and finally, that the man who had nearly become her husband had seen her, in the end, as nothing more than an obstacle. Logan stood outside the door. Amelia asked him, "Are you going to disappear again?" Logan said, "I thought you needed your family right now." Amelia answered, "I just learned that family isn't always the people who share your last name." It was a clearer step toward romance than anything before it, though still restrained and unhurried. Mason stood in the doorway during the arrest and found himself unable to look away from Cameron's face in the last seconds before the officers let him out. There was no anger left in it, only a kind of flat calculation, as though he were already working out his next move rather than reckoning with what he had done. It struck Mason, watching it, that he had spent years admiring that same calm in boardrooms without ever asking what it looked like when there was nothing left to calculate his way out of. He walked back into Amelia's room feeling as though he had learned something about his own judgment that he would carry for a long time. Before he could say anything else, Amelia asked whether the invitation he had made before the crash, for a real date, still stood. The weeks that followed passed slowly. Amelia left the hospital and returned to the company step by step in careful stages. Carter Mobility publicly announced the fraud investigation, recalled the dangerous components, and began cooperating fully with authorities. The stock price dipped in the short term. Joseph wanted to withhold certain details to protect the family name. Amelia refused. Logan supported that decision without hesitation. "Trust isn't built by hiding the thing that scares people," he told her. Joseph eventually accepted that Logan was exactly the kind of person his daughter needed beside her. A genuine respect grew between Mason and Logan over those weeks. Elizabeth remained a little wary of how different their two worlds truly were, until she watched Amelia beside Logan one evening and saw something new. Not the chief executive. Not the heir to a company. Just a woman who could laugh without calculating who might be watching her. The romance settled into something quieter and more ordinary. Amelia and Logan had their first real date at a small, unremarkable restaurant. Nothing polished, nothing built for cameras. Amelia asked why he had picked such a plain place. Logan told her, "Nobody here cares how many shares you own." Amelia laughed and said that might be the worst invitation she had ever heard in her life. Logan answered, "And yet you still came." They both laughed at that. Ella appeared only briefly in a later scene, when Amelia visited Logan's home for dinner one evening. Nobody ever let the child do the work of pulling the two adults together. What mattered was what Amelia noticed watching them. Logan never tried to position her as some replacement mother figure. He didn't need her money. He had already built a full life of his own long before she ever entered it. That balance was what made the relationship feel steady rather than convenient. Amelia eventually admitted the thing that frightened her most. It was not the crash itself. It was realizing she had lost the ability to tell who actually stood beside her for her, rather than for what she represented. Logan answered her gently, "Then don't trust me because I helped save your life. Trust me for what I do once you don't need saving anymore." Elizabeth called her a few days later, and instead of asking about the company or the ongoing legal proceedings, she asked only how the dinner with Logan had gone. Amelia found herself smiling into the phone before she had even decided how much to say. She told her mother that, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had spent an entire evening without once checking who might be watching her, without calculating how a gesture might be read by someone with an agenda. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, then said that was the first time Amelia had sounded like herself in years. Not the executive, not the heiress, just her daughter. By the end of that evening, Amelia reached for Logan's hand first, with no crisis around them and nothing left to fear in the moment. 6 months passed. Cameron and the others involved in the scheme were formally charged. Carter Mobility finished overhauling its entire testing and certification process. Amelia created an independent safety division that reported directly to the board rather than through any financial reporting line that could pressure its findings. She offered Logan the position of leading it. Logan turned down a full-time executive role. He did not want what existed between them to be reshaped into a relationship built on power. Instead, he agreed to serve as an independent advisor, and Amelia respected the choice completely. It was proof that the romance had never turned Logan into a man rescued by a wealthy executive's money. At a small dinner at the Carter family home, Logan appeared for the first time openly as the man Amelia was seeing. Joseph found himself thinking back to that night at the hospital when no one in the family had known who this man even was. He said, "It's strange, 6 months ago your name was the strangest thing anyone in that room had ever heard." Mason joked that now Amelia mentioned Logan so often the family could barely forget him if they tried. The mood was light and easy. After dinner, Amelia and Logan stepped out onto the porch together. Amelia asked him, "Do you know what the first thing I remember was when I woke up?" Logan guessed, "My name?" Amelia shook her head. What she remembered was the feeling that came before it. His voice on the phone, calm and steady, guiding her through the crash, telling her not to give up. She said, "I said your name because in that moment I knew you would come." Logan answered simply, "I did come," Amelia said, "and you're still here." She told him that in the months since the crash, she had watched her family learn his name the way people learn the name of someone who had always belonged among them, slowly, then completely, until the strangeness of that first night in the hospital felt like it belonged to another life entirely. Logan admitted he had expected the opposite, that a man with no fortune and no title would always be an awkward fit inside a family like hers. Amelia told him that was exactly why it worked. Nobody had handed him a place at that table. He had built one, the same patient, careful way he built every conclusion he had ever trusted enough to put his name behind. Logan leaned in and kissed her gently. There was no proposal that night, no rushed wedding, only the quiet sense of something real finally beginning. Sometimes the person who matters most is not the one a family has known for years, but the one who proves, when everything else falls apart, that they still show up anyway. There is a quiet lesson tucked inside a story like this one, easy to miss beneath the accident and the slow unraveling of a company's secrets. The people who matter most are not always the ones who have sat at our table for years, whose names our families already know by heart. Sometimes it is the stranger who tells us an uncomfortable truth instead of a comfortable lie, who shows up without asking for credit, who stays steady long after the crisis has passed and there is nothing left to gain by staying at all. Trust is never proven by a title or a familiar last name. It is proven by what someone does when no one is watching and nothing is owed. If that idea found something true in you today, carry it with you the next time you have to decide who really deserves your trust.